Today is August 11th, 2016, and I'm talking with Dr. Frank Pintar, who is a professor of neurosurgery and heads the crash injury research facility that we have, the crash worthiness facility, I believe the correct term is. So, well, thank you for taking time, Dr. Pintar. Perhaps let's start, if you could tell us, how did you first get an interest in going into the field of bioengineering? Where did that inspiration come from?
It's a long time ago, but I think early on, when I was in high school, my father is a physician, he's a pathologist, passed away since, but he actually was an inspiration to me to look into medical school. And although I was not that enamored with medical school, I did apply. I applied to the two state schools here and didn't get in. And this was actually after well, let me back up. In high school, we were talking, and I couldn't really decide on engineering or medicine. And then I learned about this exciting new field called bioengineering, which seemed like a good path to either of those professions. And so, and Marquette at that time had one of the first bioengineering programs. So that's where I applied. That's where I got in. So I pursued biomedical engineering at Marquette, but still had this interest in medicine. And so I did apply to the two Wisconsin medical schools and didn't get in. I had it was a very competitive time to get into medical school, and I had an engineering undergrad that didn't give me such a high grade point average. So I actually wasn't that disappointed. Because I mean, if I really wanted to pursue medicine, I probably would have applied all over the country and really wanted to try to get it. But so I stuck with bioengineering largely because I really enjoyed the science, and mathematics comes relatively easy with me, and so I continued in that vein in bioengineering, and then I started graduate school and started in a master's program, and once again went back to my father and said, well, my advisors are encouraging me to go on for the PhD.
Yeah, your father was on the faculty here too, wasn't he?
Correct. Yeah,
okay.
he was actually the chief pathologist at the VA hospital here in Milwaukee, and was a teaching pathologist here at the medical school as well. So yeah, for many years, and I still meet many of his people that they learned under him, their pathology rotation, and they always give me very nice compliments. He was a teacher of the pathology course. Well, he was one of the instructors that came and did some specific lectures, and that was he was mainly cardiovascular pathology, looking at arteriosclerosis and its progression and things. So it was that was actually another interesting thing for me. I grew up in that environment. He brought me to his lab every once in a while, and so tissue and dead things and and all of that wasn't scary to me at all. That was all part of and that whole medical environment was fine, just fine with me. So I actually I got the opportunity after getting my PhD to teach at Marquette for a year, but then there was essentially an assistant professor position here that opened up with Dr. Census, which is who was really my mentor, and he
was in the Department of Neurosurgery here at MCW.
Well, he was in the Department of Neurosurgery, but he also had this. He was also in it's kind of a joint appointment in bioengineering at Marquette, and so he was probably the only individual that really could bridge that gap. And now it's exciting that we're joining again between the medical school and the engineering school at Marquette to a new bioengineering department. But Dr. Census was a rare bird because he spent time with clinicians a lot, especially neurosurgeons being in the department. And he had an office right next to the neurosurgeons, and that was one of my first exposures to working with clinicians on projects, and it really piqued my interest. It was really refreshing to get ideas from the clinicians.
Now, what year would it have been that you first came and joined the faculty here?
That was 87. 87. So it's been almost 30 years.
Okay.
So yeah, that was my first year.
And you
here.
did your graduate work and doctoral work at Marquette?
At
then?
Marquette.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
So you went all the way through at Marquette.
Yeah, basically. Yeah. And that was that was also a kind of a decision along the way that I got my father's advice on and other people's, and they said basically, I remember my father telling me, if you don't mind working for somebody, then stop with the master's degree. But if you really want to be your own boss and do your own thing and pursue your own research, then you got to get the PhD. And so, but he never told me either way. He just said, if you want to do this or if you want to do that. And he was right. So my personality being such, I went for the PhD.
Now, you mentioned Dr. Census. When you interviewed here, I believe Sanford Larson was the
chair.
When you interviewed, you talked with Dr. Census, Dr. Larson, one of the other. Who were some of the other people that you may have talked with at the time?
I remember Dr. Walsh was there.
Patrick Walsh, wasn't
Patrick
it?
Walsh,
Yeah.
yeah, he was there. Dr. Joel Michaelbus was also, he was the kind of director of the labs over at the VA that were starting there. And I interviewed with him as well as a couple of other postdocs that were there at the time that they were doing their work with. But so we met with both at that time Doyne, because Dr. Census and Dr. Larson's office was on the 10th floor of Doyne Hospital at that time, and that was a wonderful view out over the pond, and that was a very nice classic old building. I remember.
Now,
remember
when
it.
you first came on the faculty and worked with Dr. Census, was your focus on crash injuries at that point, or were you working in a different area of bioengineering?
Actually, when it's interesting because it comes full circle. Dr. Census had his major grant was actually with the Navy at the time, and what they were working on was pilot ejection and the problem of spine injury, and that's why they came to our department in neurosurgery, looking at trying to perfect the seat design of pilots who are ejected out of airplanes. So if you remember aviation at the time, that's also at the time where those high performance aircrafts that the fighter pilots basically were riding in, they became so high speed that they had to trim down their design so that the pilots wouldn't even black out. So that was a matter of accelerations and trying to understand, what is that human tolerance to these high performance environments. And one of them was getting ejected out. If, at the last minute you have to eject out, and maybe you're doing high speed flying and you have to get the pilot out. And obviously one of the big dangers is that you break your spine on the way out. So if you don't eject properly, it's bad on the occupant. And there were, the early designs, there were several injuries that I was shown early on, spine injuries to these pilots. And so that was one of his projects, is to to work at the to work with the Navy on that particular project.
What were some of the other projects that you worked on?
Well, then, as that Navy project was winding down, he had this opportunity with the Department of Transportation, and he always encouraged us to apply for our own grants as well, which I started to do. I actually got my first grant from the Centers for Disease Control, and if you go back to that history, there was a national panel called Injury in America, and what they were trying to do, and they have since established, is that people never really looked at trauma as a disease, and you'll hear people like Dr. Hargarten preach this all the time, is that, hey, we have to look at trauma just as like a disease, like we look at cardiovascular or cancer or other kinds of things, because if you really look at the cause of death numbers, there's a very high percentage, it's almost always in the top 5 of cause of death for people, especially young people. The cause of death for a lot of those people is trauma. And so taking a disease approach and looking at research that can look at how injuries happen, how you can intervene, how you can do protection systems, a lot of that was really under a bioengineering domain. And so that happened in 1985, and resulting in money set aside from Congress to the Centers for Disease Control, they created actually a new center under the CDC that exists to this day, called Injury Prevention and Control, I think is the center name. But I got my first grants and grant renewal through that program.
And what were you focused on? What was your project?
That one specifically was spinal cord injury, and so that was also a very nice collaborative project. I started working with Dr. Mayman and Dr. Walsh in the spinal, basically the biomechanics of spinal cord injury, and that when you have, when people get the certain types of trauma to their head, largely contact injuries, when somebody gets hit in the head, or sports injuries. There was a whole thing on spearing and football players not leading with the head. That has since been outlawed because of that. Those often produce spinal cord injury, and the neurosurgeons obviously were very interested in the spinal cord injury, and we looked at what kind of column forces and accelerations were necessary to actually produce those kinds of cord lesions that we were looking at.
Now, again, talking about Dr. Census, if I remember correctly, he was probably one of the first people at MCW to really get involved in technology transfer. He was able to get some patents, and he was able to help launch some spin-off products and companies then too.
Yeah, I think he had a whole network of people that he worked with, and in fact, Dr. Batticletti was one of the.
That's right. Yeah.
Was one of the people. Joseph Batticletti. He also, Dr. Census pulled him from industry. He was in industry for so many years, and then he was looking at blood flow and magnetic resonance imaging at that time. We always laugh about that because Dr. Batticletti had the choice at one time to look at blood flow imaging versus more MRI imaging, and he thought that blood flow was going to be the hot thing.
Oh, well.
and he kind of guessed wrong on that one. But yeah, those are the kind of spin-offs. I mean, I remember those labs where they were creating actually magnetic fields with permanent magnets and looking at trying to get the numbers from blood flow and looking at how magnetics and the magnetic field can be used to measure all those kinds of things. So at that time, they never thought that imaging was going to be that big of a deal. But that's the technology that really led to they called it nuclear magnetic resonance back then, but nuclear wasn't a great word. So,
Yeah.
So they just dropped the nuclear and went to
Now,
MRI.
is it safe to say Dr. Census would have been one of your mentors here?
Oh, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Were there others?
Dr. Michaelbust as well. I mean, he was
Joel Michaelbust.
Joel Michaelbust. Yeah. He's since gone on to go to the FDA and look at actually technology transfer in that government agency. He's actually quite high up, from what I understand. But yeah, he was also one of my mentors, and he was also very big on technology transfer and being able to take what we learned in the lab and either work with a company to develop it further or to try a spin-off and that kind of thing. So yeah, a number of people that we trained ended up in GE or other types of companies that use that technology.
Were there others that you were collaborating with here in either within the Department of Neurosurgery or other departments at MCW when you worked on some of these projects?
Oh, along the way, there's been so many, and it's really it's always been wonderful. I mean, I get these jealous looks from when I'm talking with people from other universities and other institutions, because I say I never have a problem. I can pick up the phone and call up an orthopedics surgeon, and he'll make an appointment with me in the next week to look at research that I need his help on. Or I can call up a neurosurgeon. I can pull a neurosurgeon in from his office and say, "Can you look at these CTs and help me interpret them?" So I always have medical people that at the ready, so to speak. And the people here at MCW have, I've just never met a bad egg that they. I mean, they all are very happy to collaborate, and as soon as I give them a research problem, they're always very interested and say, "Sure, I'll help you out. Let me do that." And so, and actually, if you look at my CV, I think I have publications with almost every neurosurgeon on our faculty. Not the new ones lately, but the almost every neurosurgeon. I have orthopedic surgeons. I've done work with otolaryngology. We actually looked at the mechanics of cochlear implants when they were first put in, and looked at whether the vibration in the cochlear implant was going to cause any disturbance in the after the surgery. I've done work with plastic surgeons and looking at their microsurgery on fingers, and they came to our lab to look at how strong their sutures were. We've done orthopedic surgeons, foot and ankle, looking at mechanism of injury in skiing accidents and things like that. So a number of different collaborations, and actually with Dr. Hargarten on gunshot wounds, looking, that was one of the very cool things that we did, and that was with the Wisconsin Crime Lab here, that or locally in down on the south side. We actually looked at when Dr. Generelli was here as the chair. We looked at surviving gunshots to the head, and it was an amazing discovery. Well, not discovery, but a realization that a lot of more than 50% of people that have been shot in the head actually survive, and most people wouldn't realize that. But then we started looking at different ways of being able to understand who was going to survive and who wasn't, depending on their lesion and a bunch of other things. So we did some interesting physical tests down at the Wisconsin Crime Lab, and so there's a lot of different departments we've collaborated with over the years.
When did the interest come about, either with you or within MCW or neurosurgery, to start looking at crash injuries?
Well, I mean, that was early on. I mean, with Dr. Census, and then Dr. Yoganandan came on board as well. The three of us looked at this new grant opportunity with the Department of Transportation, and that was that was actually part of the CDC effort. So the first CDC grants that they handed out for that injury control were actually joint efforts between the Department of Transportation and the CDC, because the Department of Transportation, actually National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NDOT, NHTSA, they say, NHTSA is always very interested in safety standards. And to develop those safety standards, they need basic science research in terms of human tolerance and what does it take, how many G's or what kind of force does it take, before somebody breaks a bone and that kind of thing. So that's all bioengineering stuff. So that was early on. That was in the late 80s and early 90s, and we started with a joint effort between the CDC and NHTSA, and later on, as we got to know the people within NHTSA, we applied for funding for their purpose just on vehicle-related crashes and vehicle-related trauma. Early on, it was more generalized and looking at spinal cord injury and head injury, just in all types of trauma. But then as we worked just for the Department of Transportation, it was vehicle-related.
So when you look at your initial vehicle work, what were the things you were looking at that time? Was it airbags? Was it seatbelts? Was it just the compartment itself and dangers that it worked? Or
yeah. So the interesting thing at the time was that if you remember, the seatbelt wearing rate was fairly low. It was probably less than 50%. It has since climbed to around 80% or 85%, and depending on which state you're in. But at the issues at the time were looking at the early crash test dummy, the Hybrid 3, which is still quite in use today, actually had a single measurement of chest deflection, and it was based upon somebody who was unbelted and that would have, in a frontal crash, would have collided with the steering wheel. So that's why you almost always, the steering wheel is directly in front of the driver, he crushes into it, and all you need is one measurement to say whether that person had a fatal chest injury. So as seatbelts came more and more into the general vehicle population and airbags, then they started looking at, well, is that measurement enough? So that's what NHTSA's problem was, is can we go with one measurement or not? And they were looking already to develop the next generation of crash test dummies.
And this was already when seatbelts had advanced to the point where it was more than just around your waist.
Right.
It was
also in
a
the
strap over your...
Right.
Yeah.
And if you also remember, some of the early, they were supposed to be 3-point belt with shoulder, but there was also the idea of the automatic belt where that single belt came back. Zzz, you remember that one?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
It came here, but the problem was that a lot of people forgot or just didn't bother buckling the lap belt, and so all they were was restrained by the shoulder belt. And so that was another one of our projects, is to look at that configuration without the lap belt. And through the Siren program at that time, there's the which we are now Crash Injury Research and Engineering Network. That is a network that we're in, a multi-center grant that we're involved in now and have been for the last 10 years, looking at real-world crashes in late model vehicles and how people get injured. At that time, the Siren program saw that the people that were belted only with that 2-point shoulder belt were really getting bad liver injuries, and it was largely because your pelvis was allowed to go forward, and your lower rib cage, right where your liver is, really took the brunt of this, and so there was a lot of people, and so that's why you don't see it today in vehicles. You won't. I mean, that was essentially enough for them to say, let's get rid of that.
Now, you mentioned the airbags then as well, and at that point, airbags were basically at the front of the car, and so if there was a crash, the airbag would come out at your...
It was only the two, yeah.
And so some of your work then was also looking at, well, not all injuries are head,
That's right. Yeah, the whole injury spectrum started to shift, and this is something that we knew because we were used to working with neurosurgeons and trauma surgeons and ER docs. They're all saying, hey, we're seeing different patterns of injury. That was the whole point of the Siren program, is to look at injury from the clinical perspective and see, are the docs actually telling us that they're seeing different patterns? And so as airbags and 3-point seatbelts came in, people were the fatalities dropped actually tremendously, because people mostly died of chest and head injuries. As those got taken care of, all of a sudden we noticed lower leg injuries. So that was another episode of, now that we're saving them from the fatal injuries, what are they most injured in? And lower legs was one of the top items, and so we did some work in that area.
And what if that was looking at, and that would be if the engine would come through and into the cabin then, right?
Yep, and basically twist your foot or pin it between the pedal and other kinds of things.
And how do you remedy that? Because airbags don't come out at the base, though, do they?
No, but there are like breakaway pedals and other devices that they have looked at. There's also they also learned how to limit intrusion in the occupant space so that the floorboards wouldn't intrude, and so they're building the front engine design such that that intrusion didn't take place.
So when did the side impact airbags?
Then that was the next generation. Was the early on there was the first standards from NHTSA were only in frontal impact. So the car manufacturers only had to pass a frontal impact safety standard. There were no other standards. There were other manufacturing standards, but in terms of safety. And then there was a big push in the mid-90s to create a side impact standard, and the people that we had our grant funding from really were emphasizing side impact performance. So because they wanted to find out specifically what kind of protection they could offer in side impact. So they looked at the standard. The most common side crash is a T-bone intersection crash, where the driver is impacted on their near side, and most of the time you get pelvis and chest injuries and head injuries. So we looked at that particular problem, and at the same time, the NHTSA was developing a side impact crash test dummy. And so we were trying to translate the measures from the field and from experiments that we were doing into to define new standards of safety for that side impact crash dummy. And
you mentioned the crash dummies. A lot of your research, a lot of the findings that you have are only as good as the quality of the dummy that can provide you with information. So isn't one of your challenges to help create a smarter or better crash dummy then as well?
Yes, absolutely, and that is part of our bioengineering and medical effort, being able to look at actual injuries in people and translate that kind of trauma into a dummy metric. So if we think that chest deflection is something, and most of these side impact dummies use deflection sensors to be able to predict injury, that becomes the standard by which the vehicle is tested, and so that has been really the two things that have the main areas, two things that drive our research are creating the basic science standards of human tolerance. What does it take to fracture a bone or to have a lung contusion? What does it take? What are the measurements that you can do to define that? And then to look at the crash, the practical application of that is measurements using a crash test dummy, and how we use the term biofidelic. How human-like is that crash test dummy? So we are constantly evaluating prototype sensors and prototype dummies, or we change the chest around. Can you reevaluate this? So we are that side of the whole equation of looking at new crash test dummies and improving the ones that we have.
Now, you're not the only siren center in the country. I believe there are 11?
There are 5 other. Well, there's 6 total now.
Okay. What kind of collaboration exists among the siren centers?
Oh, a lot. In fact, we were actually one of the advocates of changing the program, and this happened prior in the early 2000s, where we pushed for peer review between the centers, and so built a collaborative case review type setting. Prior to that, the siren center that collected the case would essentially just present the case and say, here's our theory of injury and this is what it is. And the data was put in the database. We all contribute to the same database. And there was never any quality control beyond that. And we pushed for interactive things because we said, hey, we're from a department of neurosurgery. We really think we should be involved in all the cases that have something to do with head or spine injury, because we have the expertise to look at that. And they bought that. They really bought into that idea, and they actually changed the siren program to have a peer review process. So we're doing conference call reviews of case presentations, and we interact with the other center and go over the data and actually drive to consensus on what really happened.
Is there anything that makes our siren center unique compared to the other ones in the country? I believe something was said at one point where the others are more tied to a specific car manufacturer or something like that. Is that
early on they were? That has since, when there were more siren centers, there were actually some that were funded by Toyota or GM, and there was sometimes a hint of a bias, but we now they're all funded by the federal government, and so one thing that makes us unique is that we have the full facilities of. We're the only one that have a full vehicle crash lab and a sled lab where we do the occupant part of the research, and a full biomechanics lab. So we have the laboratory facilities are really what make us unique.
And you meant, talking about the facilities, there was an upgrade to the facilities at some point. When did that occur, and what was
I've had.
What was the difference in the facilities for you?
I think I've had 3 or 4 different building projects
Okay.
over my career. The first one was actually our first sled, and that was early on with still when Dr. Census was still here. We obtained a bungee cord driven sled. It's like a big slingshot. You basically pull back. A lot of when we test the crash test dummies to just look at what they're doing in the occupant compartment, we put them on a sled, and it's basically the size of the interior of your car, but you need to simulate the deceleration that occurs when you're in a crash. And so this was driven by bungee cords with big elastic shock cords, and they were the only place you could get them were from people that did bungee jumping off of cliffs and bridges and things like that. So and we had to sign all sorts of papers that it wasn't going to be used for that and all that. So this sled was actually previously used by Southwest Research Institute down in San Antonio, and that we bought used. But then we had to set it up in a building, and that building was on the VA campus. It's in Building 2, which was a very old. It was like post-World War II building. It's still there. It's a beautiful old Gothic style building. I think it was finished in 1869 or something. And that was our first big building project that Yoga and I ended up coordinating with, the plans and all the things that we had to do. Then the upgrade was to create this new sled. Well, sorry. The second thing we did was to create, when Dr. Larson was still here, he invested in the vehicle crash lab. So the person that we worked with in NHTSA on the basic biomechanics studies had moved within NHTSA to be head of the vehicle crash program. And he actually encouraged us. He never put it on paper, but he encouraged us. He said, there's not enough independent vehicle crash labs around the country that we can do this work at. So if you build it, we will come. Okay. It was that saying. So basically, Yoga and I went to Dr. Larson and said, how about a vehicle crash lab? And we thought it was pie in the sky stuff at that time, but we thought we'd throw it out there. And he's asking us, well, what is it going to cost? And do you have the room and all this kind of stuff? So we went through that whole building project, and that was the vehicle crashworthiness facility that you're talking about. And that was it actually just started with one big 100-foot by 80-foot building that we did the crash in, and it went outside, and we towed the vehicle and crashed it inside, and got that. Since we've enclosed the track as well, but that was the second building project. And the third building project has been, now we've gone from the bungee cord sled to an acceleration, a pushing type sled, which is now also programmable. So you can actually get very different pulse sequences. And a big reason for that is that different agencies now are very particular on the crash pulse that's going on. So, for instance, we are funded from the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, to look at airplane seat design and in survivable crashes, and they have their unique pulse that we put on the sled.
So, in the work that you're doing, every time there's a crash that you're studying, you have different sensors. How many sensors, how many different points, how many different cameras do you have involved looking at all these different things? And this is where the work of a bioengineer comes in, to be able to identify, well, these are all the points that we have to take into consideration. How vast is that? I
think our our record on the number of channels that we've tested are something like 520, something like that, 520 channels at the same time, and that's aside from cameras, and that we have to capture that in the frame of 100 milliseconds. We have to capture all that data in that frame, and then our 3D camera system is 20 cameras. They work together to give you a full 3D picture of occupant movement, and high-speed cameras that are all anywhere from $25,000 to $100,000 cameras. For high speed, there's usually at least 5 or 6 of those cameras going. So all of that has to be coordinated.
And all of this equipment you have to build.
We don't have to build. We purchase it, but we have to integrate it into the lab.
Okay.
So yeah, early on we built a lot of the first data acquisition systems and other things, but as the technology developed, especially on the digital technology, that you were able to purchase that.
And when you purchase the cars that are used in the studies, you don't reveal to the dealer that you're working with that this is the purpose, do you?
They may or may not know. Most of the time, if we're doing a crash test for the government actually gives the local dealer a call and says, "We need this and this kind of car. Do you have it?" And usually
the dealer
dealers
puts two and two together.
Yeah, they put two and two together, and then especially because the government just pays list price, and they're very happy with that. Okay. And then the dealer comes and drives the car up and gives us the keys, and so that's
Okay.
that's basically it. But really, the government actually orders the vehicle, so they often figure it out when they realize where they have to drive it to.
Okay. And you look at the different things that you've worked on with some of the different studies that have been done. What are some of the findings that you're proudest of? Things that you feel have helped contribute to?
Ooh, there's a lot of them.
Okay.
Well, I think the side impact standards are one of them that really are a complete package. We really, if you look at the foundation of those studies, you'll see our publications and our basic science in a lot of those a lot of those standards, and because when they write up the standards, they give a lot of background information. Very few people actually look at that, but we had a lot to do with the safety standards. So all over the world, we're known for side impact standards with side airbags, looking at side airbag effectiveness, as well as the standards themselves. So I mean, I go to Europe or Japan, and they know me because of those publications, and so they're and it's not just being known for it. It's also that knowing that our laboratory has affected the lives of the safety of people. So those standards are standards by which vehicles are held to, and they have to meet those minimum safety standards. Mm-hmm. So that is one of the most things. One of the things I'm most proud of. We're doing some different things with the FAA. As I said, we actually recently looked at their side seat standards. Before we got involved in the program, there were no side seat standards for the FAA in terms of it was again all frontal impact. They as you know, you've been on an airplane, it's almost all lap belt, and they have a lap belt standard, but now they were looking at side because there's a lot of new regional jets that have side-facing seats, and if you crash in that configuration, even in a survivable crash, you need a standard for that. So that we contributed directly to that standard. So without our work, they wouldn't have been able to write that standard. Our ongoing work is is an oblique standard for the FAA. We're still actually in that project, but that will result in an oblique. If you've seen on the new Dreamliners and the other ones, there's a lot of oblique facing seats.
Yes.
There's also no standard for those seats currently, so that will be the next thing that we influence. I'm also proud of the military work that we're doing. I mean, we're really contributing now to the safety standards for military vehicles. That's an ongoing project as well. There's actually we're working on a brand new dummy just for the military environment in underbody blast. So vehicles going over IEDs and those kinds of
So with
things.
the hope that we may be able to manufacture a vehicle that has better base or bottom that would
Yeah,
protect.
I mean they've already done a vehicle design changes, but now we're talking about what happens to the occupant during that. Can we change the seat design, the restraint system? I mean, we're looking at a lot of the same things that we did or we have been doing in the vehicle in the regular automotive environment, but now the vector direction is different. It's all coming from underneath, and so restraint designs have to be different. Seat designs, there's energy absorbing seats, and how much do you let them stroke, and there's a number of different variables there.
The opportunities and the areas to study are endless. When you
Always
look
seems
at,
like it.
between,
That's why I still have a job.
You've also had the opportunity to mentor as well. We talked about you were
Oh, yeah.
mentored before by Dr. Census, by Dr. Michael Bust, but then you've had a chance to work with doctoral students,
Sure.
students. When you look at that opportunity, are there people that have worked with you that you've helped mentor that have gone on to careers, and are there any that stand out that you want?
Yeah,
to
there's a number of our graduate students have really done seminal work in their area. Ali El Hagdiab was a PhD student with me and then went on to work for GM, and he is actually when he was working with GM, he was working with another colleague that I know very well from, he actually went from GM to Ford, Steve Ruhana, and he always talks about how great my student was, and so I get from Ford and GM, I get requests like this all the time. Do you have any graduating students? So he actually helped him develop a new crash dummy insert for the dummy to look at abdomen injuries in particular. So that was my student helped this Ford guy develop that, and also some work on 4-point seatbelts that are still ongoing now. But so that's another one. And then the last one I'll tell you about is Jason Hallman, who did his major work on side airbag injuries. So the potential that, with whether a protection system like an airbag can actually harm you, and we looked at that. And his thesis was his publications got numerous awards, and now he works for Toyota, and he's one of their chief scientists looking at safety measures at Toyota. So I'm in contact with him. Wow. And so he's making an impact in that company as well. So
You came on board here at MCW in 1987. As we look ahead 30 years later now, what are some of the changes that you've seen from what MCW was like in 1987 to what we are today?
Well, it's just been a tremendous growth. I mean, I don't remember how many faculty there were back in 1987, but I felt it was like I knew them all. Like I was exposed, like I could go down the hallway and talk to the orthopedics guys. I could go down I knew who the surgeons were, and I knew who the rehab people were. You know, I mean, we could talk to a lot of people. The growth has allowed new opportunities, but it's also made us really large. That in that, you know, I have to know key people in different departments, and I still have those relationships that are ongoing. But the phenomenal growth in both the faculty and the facilities, and you know, what we've seen on campus with freighted expansion and children's expansion and the schools expansion is just. I'm very proud to when I have guests around, and I actually quite often from different countries or different parts of our country, I just even drive them through the complex of the medical center grounds, you know, and they're always like, wow, you know, this is huge, this is immense, you know, all these different facilities. So it's very encouraging to see that this community supports such a important enterprise, and that it's grown to the point to really be a nationally recognized place, and that you know, there's a lot of people that know us. We're on the map, so to speak, and I think that's what's happened over the 30 years is that I can travel anywhere in the world, and they know. The funny thing is, I used to have to correct them because they'd always say, "Oh, UW-Madison, right? University of Wisconsin." You know, I'd have to, and I remember having to put early on my PowerPoint slides, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Medical College of Wisconsin, and I still. It doesn't happen actually anymore, but early on it was, oh, Dr. Pintar from University of Wisconsin. You know, it was that. Now we are really our own entity. Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee is now recognized.
We've talked about the growth here. What's the same? Are there values? Is there a spirit or anything that existed when you came that still exists today?
I can still call up my clinical colleagues. I can call them up and, you know, give them a ring and say, hey, I'm working on this, I'm stumped on this problem clinically. This is in your area of expertise. Can you give me a hand? And it's just never any hesitation. I mean, the faculty members that we have are always helpful. They're always willing to point me in the right direction if I'm looking for that. There's still just a very collegial environment, and that hasn't changed. That's been the same.
You're an alumnus of Marquette. You've worked here for years in bioengineering, and now things are coming full circle where we're partnering with Marquette on the creation of a
very exciting.
If you would you recommend the field of bioengineering to a student today? And when you look at the opportunities with the partnership with Marquette, what do you see for the future?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that the whole field of bioengineering has blossomed into so many different areas. There's you know, sensor designs and imaging, and you know, even wearables. You know, how that has come into play, and all of these are sensors and programs that look toward or work with bioengineering systems. So anytime you have the interface between technology, or when I give lectures on this, it's always man-machine interface. It's the I should say human-machine interface now. But any human-machine interface is really the subject of bioengineering. That's how broad it is. You know, I deal specifically in safety and trauma, but there's so many different aspects of bioengineering that are just wonderful to be able to bridge that gap between the medical science, biology, and the engineering science, and it's just a wonderful growth opportunity. I think we'll have a lot of new innovation. I think the the whole bench to bedside, I think will get a strong boost from bioengineering involvement.